Hi, I'm John Basalis, housing analyst and founding broker at Realosophy Realty, where I lead our team of agents in providing data-driven real estate advice to home buyers and home sellers throughout Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. We launched this Toronto Real Estate Summit because we're getting a lot of questions from consumers about the volatility in our economy and our housing market that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be talking to leading economists, housing industry leaders, personal finance experts, and real estate agents to get a better understanding of what's going on in our markets today and what are some of the key things that we should be looking for in the months ahead so you can all make smarter real estate decisions. If you have more specific questions about your home buying and selling needs, please feel free to email me anytime at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Hi everyone, John Basalis here from Realosophy Realty. So right now we're going to be hearing from Frances Donald. Frances is the global chief economist for Manulife. She's constantly on TV breaking down these big macroeconomic trends and data points into sort of simple stories that we can all understand to kind of make better sense of what's going on in the economic environment around us. She's incredibly active on Twitter. If there's one economist you should be following on Twitter, it's definitely Frances, and today she's going to help us make sense of what we should be looking for in the months ahead in terms of sort of how our economy is going to respond and recover in response to this shock from COVID. So without any further delay, let's jump right into my chat with Frances Donald. All right, Frances, thank you so much for joining us today for our Toronto Real Estate Summit. We appreciate you taking the time and kind of helping us think through some of the macro trends that are going on in our economy. So thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into our chat. Now, kind of before we talk about, what's been going on since COVID, I think it'd be helpful if you kind of maybe give us an overview of, what you thought sort of in the beginning of the year of sort of where Canada's economy is going and what things look like kind of pre-COVID. And then we'll kind of get into sort of how things have changed since then. So what was kind of the economy looking like even in January, February, kind of before this pandemic really hit us?
Well, you might be the only person that ever asks me what I thought the world was like before COVID hit. And it's a really clever question because as much as COVID makes us feel like the entire world changed, a lot of how various economies are going to do and fare in recovery is actually based on where our starting place was. So heading into the year, I'm not going to say anything that not everyone understands. We thought Canada was vulnerable to a shock. Now, we didn't know what that shock was going to be. We thought it could be geopolitical risks. We thought it could be the US election outcome. I don't know anybody who thought it would be, of course, a global pandemic. And why was Canada vulnerable to shocks? Well, a big part of it had to do with how much leverage was in the economy, how much debt people had. Now, I got to frame that a little bit. Everybody talks about, Canadians have so much debt, and they'll say they have this much debt relative to income or assets. I hate that. That's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is how much that debt costs us. So heading into the crisis, out of every $100 that a Canadian took home, they were spending about $14 on the debt and principal and interest on their debt. That's kind of a lot of money. Taking home $100, 14 automatically gets wiped off. And what worried us is that cost of debt would start to rise. So we were thinking about things like, will interest rates be higher, for example, which will Canadians take on even more debt in order to maybe get bigger houses, or maybe they'll take off HELOCs, and then all of a sudden that $14 becomes 15, 16, 17. And when that happens, that extra money has to come from somewhere. That was our really big concern, is that Canadians basically out of their take-home money, we're just going to have to put more and more money towards debt. Now, why that makes you vulnerable is because if you owe $14 out of every 100 and you lose your job, well, you probably don't have enough savings to cover. And that was the other reason that Canada was vulnerable, very low savings rate, particularly compared to the United States and abroad. Now, on top of that, we knew that the energy industry not getting as much love as it used to, both in terms of foreign inflows, in terms of, the marketing towards it. So we knew that one of the pillars of growth in the country was also very weak. And the third reason that we were somewhat concerned is that Canada, I love it here, I want to live here forever. not a very great place to attract business. A lot of red tape, a lot of regulations. So we've been hoping for a long time that Canada would be able to absorb other forms of industry to take over from the energy patch, but we hadn't seen the sort of deregulation that required it. So heading into the year, I didn't have a particularly exciting forecast for Canada. 2% inflation, 2% growth, housing market inflated, high debt, low savings. What became so important to understand about that period, though, is that's the starting place, and a very different starting place than how, for example, our American neighbors were looking.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, actually. I mean, touching on this issue of debt, which has come up a lot then, one thing that is interesting over the past 10 years, I mean, of course, U.S. households have really deleveraged and their household debt kind of fell after the financial crisis, but Canadians went up. And I guess one question is, I mean, how did we get to this point where Canadian households are so leveraged? Is it just the product of low rates, or kind of how did we get to this point where we have these debt vulnerabilities in our market?
It's funny. I remember being a teenager, and my dad bought a really big house, and he said to me in Montreal, and he said to me, Francis, always buy a house you can't afford, because they always go up in value and you always make more money over time. That was like my dad's sage financial advice to me: buy a house you can't afford. But it stuck with me for a long time, even before I became an economist, because I always thought the mission was to buy a house you couldn't afford because the price always went up. This is so ingrained in our psychology that it actually affects the way that we behave as Canadian consumers. Mm-hmm. It also affected the way that Americans behaved and the way that Americans acted as consumers as well. Always buy a house you can't afford because it always goes up in value, interest rates always go down, and your income always rises. What was so profound about 2008 for the American psyche was this terribly difficult lesson that home prices don't always go up over a 5-year horizon or a 10-year horizon, that we can see bumps in the road. Mm-hmm. What I'm kind of most concerned about for Canada is not that we see a bump in the road, because we may see home prices fall, but they will eventually recover. I don't know exactly how long it's going to take. And if you're buying a house for 20 years, then my dad's probably right. But Canada never experienced that psychological shock. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the reasons that America is in a better standpoint now than Canadians is because after they experienced that psychological shock, they started saving more. So they started realizing, oh crap, you can't actually lose your job and the value of your house can actually decline. You better have some money on the sidelines. Now, Canada didn't experience that. Why not? A couple of reasons we have a lot of debt here. Some is that, and I'll be clear, our debt is not uniform across the entire country. It's basically Torontonians and Vancouverites, people who live in Vancouver. I should know that one by now. It's really BC and Ontario that carry those tremendous amounts of debt. And in part, that's been inflated by the housing bubble. Why? Or the housing market. You don't even have to call it a bubble if you don't want to. The housing market. Why? Extraordinarily low interest rates, of course. That is a key component to the story. Very large economic growth. These have been the engines of Canadian economy, and that's why I kind of struggle with the bubble concept until about 2016 is only when we start seeing bubble characteristics. But then there's another component which I don't feel gets enough attention, and that's immigration. So immigration has been the secret sauce to Canadian growth for at least the last 4 years, and it drove up demand. Suddenly we just have tons of people, tons of competition to buy those homes. So when we think about what are the risks to debt, why would we see a deleveraging, we have to kind of think about those three components. What's going to happen to interest rates? Well, they're likely to stay very low. What's going to happen to economic growth? Well, that will be problematic. We know that. How long? We'll wait and see. And then what happens to the immigration component? Immigration is probably where I have the most concerns, because we have shut borders, and I'm not sure how much policy we're going to see towards immigration if we have double-digit unemployment rates. So, again, your questioning is so appropriate you should really be like a CNBC reporter because your questions are better than I get from them. Because they really highlight, if you want to understand what happens next, if you want to understand the unraveling of the system, you have to understand how we got here in the first place. And my sense is, too many people are looking at this and saying, COVID shut restaurants, and not recognizing maybe our biggest risks are things like a policy retrenchment of immigration demand for housing. These are the types of things we have to think about.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, kind of moving on to sort of this idea of what has happened since COVID. I remember reading or hearing an interview you did, and I thought it was really interesting. And you mentioned that, things are going along pretty well in Canada, and all of a sudden COVID hit and it kind of pinpointed these vulnerabilities in our market. And I guess kind of going back on that, are you kind of thinking about sort of the vulnerabilities with respect to debt and these things, or what specifically did you have in mind when you thought that, COVID was kind of really pinpointing some of the weak spots in our economy?
So absolutely, elevated levels of debt, low savings rates, lack of diversity amongst employment in the country. So, needing to have additional sectors, but also some of the more social components. So, a big one that I've talked about is the lack of accessible, affordable childcare. I don't talk about that from a social angle. I talk about that as, an economist who looks at numbers. And oftentimes I hear critiques like, Toronto the housing is so unaffordable. Well, what's really unaffordable about Toronto, for example, is not actually housing. It's housing and childcare combined. So you may have if you're lucky, $3,000 mortgage, $4,000 mortgage, but if you're paying $2,000 a month after tax for childcare, then the ability to have a family in downtown Toronto basically gets removed from any reasonable family, right? Even if you're two white-collar workers. So for a long time, I talked about this economic crisis of childcare compounding lack of housing affordability. But it wasn't until COVID that people started realizing childcare is this essential component. We could talk about how we have likely underpaid services sector employees. That's been something that COVID has shown a light on. Massive inequalities. So who are those who get COVID? Who are those who are most likely to be unemployed? Are our most vulnerable workers? The list goes on and on. I mean, there's a temptation for me to focus on the economic components, but it would be wrong to not highlight that there are real social issues or socioeconomic issues that this has really shown a light on. In Quebec, where I am now, long-term care homes were particularly badly hit. Are those a policy perspective that we should be paying attention to at the same time? So there's kind of a whole variety of weaknesses that COVID particularly shone that difficult light on. Yeah.
That's great. Now, kind of before we move on to sort of how our economy's kind of responded since then, I think it'd be good to maybe hit pause and maybe we chat briefly a little bit about the policy responses. So I think a lot of people are familiar with a lot of the things our federal and provincial governments have done to support incomes through CERB payments and wage subsidies, supporting commercial businesses with rents. Now, one question we've been getting from a lot of the people who signed up for our summit is, how do we pay for this? And what does, it's great. I think generally people obviously have been really supportive of what the federal government's doing, but then you have people start thinking about, well, what does the world look like in 12 months, And it does it, of course, mean higher taxes. And what are we going to have? Are we going to have sort of wealth taxes that kind of have been proposed south of the border through some politicians or capital gains taxes on homes? How are we going to pay back this debt in the future?
Okay, so the number one comment I'll make here is that it's not likely we have to address paying back this debt for at least 5 to 10 years. Okay, that is not a near-term thing. It's not like taxes are going up next year for a couple reasons. One is that it would crush the economy. Two is that you're really only going to do it when your economy is strong enough to withstand. Three is that the hope with debt is always that you outgrow it. Now, I say hope because this doesn't always happen, but most governments globally will say things like, when we look at debt, we don't look at the amount of debt we have the debt relative to our total growth. And where we start to get more worried is when that ratio starts to climb. You have more debt than you do growth. Now, the idea behind significant spending is that you can do the reverse. You can actually grow your debt, but grow your economy even faster. So I'll give you an example. If you provide, let's say, CERB payments, and you extend them for a period of time, let's say you and I were unemployed, we went out, we decided to spend them on, well, I guess we're not going to lunch together yet, maybe a patio lunch, okay? Wearing our masks and doing it safely. We go for patio lunch, we spend money, we are taxed. The restaurant then pays taxes. The employee then picks up or has a payroll tax out of that, and they actually grow their revenue by us using the economy. So the general hope when governments spend a huge amount of money is that we go, we take it, we spend it, and then a big portion of it ends up back with the government in some way. But the biggest reason that we don't probably have to worry about this right now, as in we don't have to worry about our taxes going up just yet, is the Canadian government actually started from a very strong fiscal position, one of the best in the OECD. And for now, interest rates for government debt are very, very low. So just like you and I care about the interest rate we get on a mortgage, when the government issues a bond, they're asking us, they're saying like, John, Francis, you guys spend some money. Can we borrow from you? We buy a bond from them. In most cases, it's things like the Canadian Pension Plan or global bond investors, but let's just use my example. And then the government is supposed to pay us interest on that, just like we pay an interest on our mortgage or we get an interest back on a savings account we might open at a bank. Right now, those interest rates are extraordinarily low in the United States, in Canada. In Canada, you can borrow for 10 years. The government can borrow for 10 years at less than 1%. Now, just like I was explaining for you and I, it's not the total amount of debt that we have that really matters, but the cost of that debt, how much we have to pay each month. For now, the costs to the government of borrowing are extremely low, and they can actually assuage the bond market. They can make global investors feel like they'll be good for it and that money will stay very, very cheap for them. So there's a hope here that they're spending on things that will rev up the economy, bring them more tax revenue over time, and actually help them pay down that debt. And in the meantime, interest rates will stay very, very low. I have to say that, Canada is not the only country that is spending a significant amount of money. This is happening on a global basis. And yes, we have seen a significant deterioration, but the United States is facing the highest debt to GDP ratio they've ever seen. Like going back to the 1800s, they have never had as much debt as they have right now. They're in a little bit more of a spot of trouble. I know that the temptation is to think about the government in the same way we think about household finances. And just from our chat, you can see that I do that all the time because I'm trying to make sense about how this works. But ultimately, they probably have 5 to 10 years before we're really paying attention to that. So we're going to see our taxes go up in the next 5 years? I would be shocked to see that. Is that something we have to pay for later on? Probably. I'm just an economist, but it's hard not to look around us and see that there are a lot of calls for what we would call, economists would call redistributive policies, which is really just like silly technical talk for, can we make our economy more fair? Do we really need to have triple billionaires? I don't know the answer to that. Like I said, I'm just an economist, but I suspect there will be more and more calls for things like wealth taxes as opposed to raises in GST, which would hurt everybody. I shouldn't say hurt. Again, I'm supposed to remain impartial, but if we do see raising of taxes, I suspect that it will probably be geared towards, like I said, redistributive policies. Wink, wink.
That's helpful. So I think one sort of segment of policy responses that I think a lot of people aren't as familiar with are the monetary policies. And of course, those are the policies that are put in place by the Bank of Canada. So maybe you can kind of walk us through some of the things that the Bank of Canada has done and how it has helped in our recovery, at least kind of now over the past, say, 2-3 months.
Okay, so explain the massive technical, incredibly difficult to understand technicalities of central banking policy. Got it.
In 5 minutes.
Okay. Game face. Okay, now we can actually make this pretty straightforward. Now, when we think about central bank policy, I want you to kind of divide it into two. Think of it like a decision tree. Now, on one side, we have traditional interest rate policy, the type that I grew up with. The type that my dad is referencing when he says buy a house you can't afford. And that's just increasing or lowering interest rates. Now, as you know, and I think you tweet about this sometimes too, just because the central bank raises or lowers interest rates doesn't mean that all the banks do that, but there should be a relationship in theory. So when the central bank cuts interest rates, for example, they cut to what they call the effective lower bound, which is 25 basis points. What they're doing is they're lowering the costs of all of our debt. So, you know, if you have a line of credit, for example, and you are making monthly payments on that, in theory, your monthly payment should be a little bit less. So if you're unemployed, or maybe you're helping your sister out who lost her job, you can send a little bit more money towards her or him. Or my sister's going to write me and say, I didn't lose my job. What are you talking about? But it's just an example. So that's one channel. It also, of course, makes debt cheaper and more attractive. So let's say I'm like, oh crap, I want to go open a line of credit because I am unemployed, or I think I might be unemployed. It will be cheaper for me to do so. But that's traditional monetary policy, and that's not really what was so significant about what the central bank did in March. What they did is they embarked on what we call unconventional monetary policy, and that's the other side of this tree. And they did this through a lot of ways, but what was so important about what the Bank of Canada did is they started quantitative easing. They have not done this before. They had the Federal Reserve in the United States had done this, but the Bank of Canada had not. What is quantitative easing? Basically, they're just buying up the bonds. They're buying up Government of Canada securities. And why do they do that? They do that because it's like a classic demand and supply. If there's a lot of demand for a bond, the interest rate on that starts to fall. And they can then not just use their traditional ways of changing the Bank of Canada rate, but they can actually change the bond curve. And based on what they buy, if they buy a 2-year bond or a 10-year bond or a 30-year bond, they can even change the shape of that. So, you know, if you're a bank and instead of trading off of the Bank of Canada rate, you decide that you're going to base your mortgage off of the Canadian bond market or the US bond market, then the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve can influence your decisions by buying up lots of bonds and suppressing the rates on the market bond curve. So that's effectively what they did. They didn't do that to help you and me out. That is not directly why that was done. In part it was, but they did that to prevent this from going from the largest economic crisis of our time to becoming the largest financial crisis of our time. Because what happened in March is they started to realize there were not enough buyers and sellers inside financial markets, not enough activity. So all of a sudden rates started spiking really high. There was all sorts of dislocations in the market. There were just not enough people. Everyone was frozen. So the Bank of Canada steps in and says, we'll buy that stuff from you. There's always a buyer of last resort. The market is always open. That's what's so critical. We always have to remember in every financial market, there's a buyer and a seller. And if you don't have one of those two sides, then you're not making the trade. So the Bank of Canada, by stepping in, has really effectively made sure there was always a buyer. Now, they're also buying other things. They're not just buying government securities. They are buying things like mortgage-backed securities. They are buying things like corporate bonds. These are things that we have not seen before in the past. They're buying provincial securities, and they're making sure that there's liquidity in all of these main transmission mechanisms. So what they've done, when you think about, you know, an economic outlook, you always have your upside risks, things that can go really, really well, and then you have your downside risks, which are like, ooh, crisis, what would go wrong if? One of the biggest downside risks was that this turns into a credit crisis, a credit crunch. The Bank of Canada didn't help us all get better. They didn't contribute to upside risks. They effectively removed the downside risks to the story. So now, instead of worrying about my worst case scenario, I just have my base case and my good scenario. So I think the Bank of Canada gets criticized a lot, like, well, how do your programs help me? They do it indirectly. And what they know, and they've been very clear about, is that they're completely aware they can prevent catastrophe, but they can't really help us recover. They can make sure that there's a buyer of bonds, but they can't prevent a company from going bankrupt. That's not the goal. They know that. We know that. I do feel sometimes like I don't know, there's a lot of critiques that they're not really helping. No, they are helping. They're just doing it very indirectly, and they're aware of what their job is.
Yeah.
Hopefully that works. I tried really hard. I might have been under 5 minutes. I'm not sure.
No, that was great. I mean, I think when a lot of people hear about the Bank of Canada lowering rates, I mean, I think they think about it as the bank trying to stimulate the economy, which of course part of it is that. But you said something I think that was interesting that I think a lot of people don't think about, which is that by lowering rates, they're also lowering every household's debt costs, and in many ways helping them get through this economic slowdown, because the interest on their line of credits and HELOCs and all of these things have lowered. So I think that's really interesting. And I don't think a lot of people think about that. They think about it as trying to encourage spending, which of course it does, but I don't think people think about it in terms of lowering their debt costs and debt burden during these times. So that was really interesting. One thing, again, we've had a couple of people ask questions, and one concern is that, with all of this buying of bonds, which is kind of what you talked about, this quantitative easing. So they're just going out and buying bonds from pension funds or whoever to effectively lower interest rates. So with all of this money pumping into the economy, some people have kind of reached out to us and wondered, well, is this going to lead to inflation, in the near future? And again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, I've read a lot of things that's not necessarily in the pipeline, but again, I think from a lot of people maybe who've taken Eco 101 courses, they hear when you pump a lot of money into the economy, it leads to higher prices. And is that something that is even on the radar for the bank and for yourself in the near future?
So we got to get our timeline straight here. In the next year to 18 months, we should be more afraid of deflation. It's more likely that prices are falling. Now, I don't know, John, if you're a big buyer of Old Navy or Gap. I am. I get all the newsletters, maybe a little Banana Republic every once in a while. I don't know if you're getting newsletters right now, but every day I open my email, 60% off, 75% off, plus 10% more. I wanted to buy a mattress, 30%. People are like trying to give me their stuff for $5, right? This is what happens when you have a massive demand collapse. People are actually just trying to get what they paid for to get their inventory out the door. Now, in the next year, we are in such an economic catastrophe that it's more likely prices are falling over this period. Once we get out till about April of next year, we're going to start seeing some turnaround. The turnaround is not coming from monetary policy. There's some really great research from the Pearson Institute in the United States, which shows you that after about 1995, the transmission mechanism between monetary policy and inflation breaks. I mean, the US pumped massive trillions of dollars into their economy, and they couldn't get above 2% inflation over the past 10 years. Why? Because the type of money that they're pumping into the economy basically sits in banks. It doesn't get to you and me. It doesn't get to your clients. It doesn't get to the listeners of today's call. That's not where it goes. But there are inflationary pressures. The inflationary pressures are just not places that you might think they are. One of them is deglobalization. So we know 30% of companies have already said, this global supply chain stuff, too complicated, too risky. If you're a company sitting in, Saskatchewan, and you're sourcing your intermediary good from somewhere in China, all of a sudden, it turns out you could get slapped with a tariff. You could have a regulatory change. The borders could close because there's a pandemic. And even though it might be cheaper to get your labor or your goods from abroad, it's not necessarily safer. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be as reliable as if you were getting it locally. So we already see a lot of data of companies saying, screw this global supply chain thing. We're going to actually source our labor and our goods domestically. We're going to pay more, but it's like an insurance mechanism. So what happens for us? What if we're buying that widget that's produced in Saskatchewan? Well, the price rises for us as well. So some of that cost is going to be passed on. And while it might not seem like the best business decision, as governments move towards tariffing things, as regulation moves away from globalization, that is one source of inflation we have to worry about. The other is actually, as much as monetary policy to me is not inflationary, no longer in this environment, fiscal policy is. Those CERB checks, inflationary. Government transfers, inflationary. The U.S. with its payment protection program, inflationary. Where does it start showing up? In my models, 2023, I get to 2.5% inflation. Is that inflation? Like, if you go back to the 1970s when my mom's telling me she got a mortgage for 18%, like that's like an era of real inflation. 2.5% inflation? No. The markets right now, if you look at forward break-evens, which is our way of getting a sense of how the bond market is pricing in, they think we only get to 1.8% inflation. So there are tricky things that we can trade in our portfolio that allow us to take advantage of that spread. But are we going back to 7, 8, 9% inflation? No. And there's a couple big reasons for that. They're structural in nature. One of them is actually one of the most inflationary forces out there is growing population. But guess what, John? People are not having babies in Canada anymore. I had one. I'm so exhausted. Like, I'm fine now. I'm good with that. One and done. My friends are like, babies? No, thank you. I'm going on vacation to Europe. Fertility rates have been dropping since 1965. 1965 was the peak fertility rate globally, and women have been having fewer babies ever since, which, as I said, I think makes sense, right? The only place that we've been getting population growth really is Canada. Canada has had the highest population growth in the OECD. It's not because we had babies. It's because we were reliant on immigration. So consistently, Canada has had slightly more inflation than the United States, and it's come in part from this population growth component. But now, particularly if we're going to have lower immigration activity and we aren't making more babies, we are not going to have the same level of structural inflation. Here's another reason: digitalization of our economy. I don't know about you, but like, let's say I want to buy a hose, okay? I go to the store, I go to Canadian Tire, I look at the counter, and then I'm like, wait a second, and I check on Amazon to see if I can get it cheaper. We have full access to pricing information now, which didn't exist even 10 years ago. How many times do you go to a store and they do price match? Like, if you go to Walmart and you're like, hey, suckers, Lowe's has it for $3 cheaper, and they will price match that for you. That is profoundly deflationary. What about things that we get for free? So, for example, this conference that you're doing, right, is accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know the value? I mean, you could value our conversation at $800,000, and here we are giving it away for free. I had a flat tire on the side of the road, and I was on the 401 driving between Montreal and Toronto. Now, we pulled over, and I immediately started YouTubing how does one change a tire. Of course, halfway through doing that, to my great delight, it turned out my husband knows how to actually change a tire on the side of the road, which was very good for our marriage. I was like, what? Secret skill I did not realize you had. But had he not had this secret, magical, very attractive skill, then I would have had to YouTube how do you change a tire. And I probably would have done it myself for free instead of hiring someone. So, even free music, how we absorb music. I use Apple Music. Apparently, I'm supposed to use Spotify. Like, I'm not a cool millennial because I use Apple Music and not Spotify. But the cost that I spend on that instead of buying CDs, I mean, there are just so many examples of the digitalization of our society that are suppressing the ability to create inflation. What I find so humorous about all this is that the central bank's mandate is still to create 2% inflation, and yet everything we do is profoundly deflationary. So, yes, if you were to keep everything equal, are we going to have more inflation 3 years from now than we do now? Yeah. Are we going to see massive inflation, 10%? Probably not. I still, by the way, am a big believer in inflation protection assets. So I'm sure half the people are going to turn off and half the people are going to like me more when I say this. I like gold in this type of environment, for example. I like hard assets like real estate. Again, I realize I'm alienating some people and winning some others over here, but there are ways that you can protect against this little bit more of inflation. But do we need to be freaking out about it? No. And in some ways, it's kind of sad because I really don't believe we're ever going to go back to really high inflation in the future.
Well, hopefully that has kind of eased the concerns of some of our viewers and the questions we got in about inflationary pressures. So that's great. Now, kind of thinking about how things have kind of evolved over the past, say, 3-4 months with COVID. We've seen a bit of an opening up of the economy and a return to the housing market. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts about, something that I think a lot of people were surprised with, including myself. I never predicted the housing market to be booming again. in this type of environment. And I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about, and this is something I think we're seeing in Vancouver and in a lot of cities in the US even, this demand, and kind of what do you think is behind this, just given the economic backdrop today?
So, in order to answer that question, I'm going to walk you through my framework for thinking about COVID. This is when I work with portfolio managers, how I explain what we need to see, and made us a good amount of money thinking about it this way. Beginning in mid-April, everybody said to me, what is the shape of the recovery going to look like? Is it a V, super fast? Is it a U? Is it an L? Nike swoosh? I saw like P's and J's, whatever. It's totally the wrong way to be thinking about this. Instead of thinking about a single letter, we need to be thinking about the recovery in stages. Okay, so we are in what I'll call stage one, the rapid rebound. Now, stage one, the rapid rebound, began in mid-April, and it will last until August or September. This is true in most major developed economies. And we've called this the rapid rebound, and our call was that most economists were way too pessimistic. They were going to miss the ferocity of the rebound across all data markers. So that includes manufacturing data, it includes jobs, it includes housing data, where actually we've been bullish. Now, why did that happen? Well, it was pretty clear. There's demand in January and February that couldn't be satisfied. People got a lot of stimulus checks, and unemployment was being softened by this significant amount of stimulus that was in the pipelines. And then we closed the economy for 2 months, which has never been done before. So all the pent-up demand that would have been created over that period gets unleashed very, very quickly. So we saw this everywhere, and it is still continuing, and we probably have several months of this occurring. Now, what's problematic about this recession is that phase one is going to look like everything's fine, and it's going to trick people into thinking, oh, I was really bearish, but now the data's fine, so I'm going to be bullish. No, this is the wrong way to do this. This is absolutely the wrong way. The trick was to be initially bullish, and then when everybody else comes onto your side is when you turn to a bear. Now, when do we get bearish? Now, I don't just mean this for housing. I mean this broadly. I am more bearish in the second half of this year and into 2021. A rebound absolutely made sense. We knew markets were going to reaccelerate to this extent. We knew we were going to see jobs numbers take off to this extent, rapid rebound. Phase two is what I'm calling the stall out. What happens in phase two? Phase two is more sinister, and it's more problematic. And a lot of people are going to get tricked into thinking recent data is how the continuation of the trend is going to occur. What happens in what I'm calling the stall out? Well, number one, companies are being asked to operate at reduced capacity. So I called my hairdresser because I was like, the only thing that matters more to me in the world is that everyone find out I am actually not a blonde, but a brunette. This is like, I don't want anyone to know this. What does he tell me? He says, you can come in, but we're not offering any blow dry. That's $45, by the way. And you have to wait outside until we call you in. And while I have your color sitting, John, you may not know this, but when you get your blonde done, you have to sit for an hour while it all settles in. And usually the hairdresser will have another person next to you that they're doing in the meantime. It's usually a man because they're very quick to do, okay? The hairdresser tells me I can't even have someone sitting next to you. So there's going to be a little bit of a premium, okay? So what's happened is that the hairdresser is going to be taking in less money, fewer clients, and while they're going to charge me a little bit more, they're not going to be able to offset the revenue loss created by social distancing. And we know this is happening everywhere. What about restaurants that had to bring in their chefs, but they can only operate their patios? They can't operate people inside. We know this is going to persist for a long period of time. What never really worried me about the COVID recession was all the people that were going to be rehired. That's fine. In the US, we knew 70% of those who lost their job would be immediately rehired. What did worry me is kind of this second economic wave, which is when companies are told to reopen and we say everything is fine, but they can't actually operate at full capacity. And when that happens, you're going to see rehiring activity stall. You're going to see a lot of government programs that drop out because, hey, you guys are open. We shouldn't be supporting you to the same extent. And you may actually even see a second wave of firing activity. That is where things become more problematic. In the first phase, where we saw this massive unemployment drop, those people mostly lost their job for temporary reasons. The next wave are going to be those businesses that have closed permanently. Think about all the companies that have now permanently closed just in the past 4 or 5 months. Mm-hmm. Things like Hertz or J.Crew, or there's a couple Reitman's branches like Additionel or Time Maternity. There's a whole variety of companies that have said they're permanently going to close. I look around me. I used to take my son in downtown Toronto to all of the indoor play gyms. Mm-hmm. Those are done. What about all the people who work there? Think about all the businesses that cannot operate at 50% capacity. Mm-hmm. So why do I explain this? I explain this because the pain that we're going to feel in the economy is not now. Now is fine. You want to buy a house right now? Go for it. What's going to hurt is the second half of this year and into 2021. That's when we're going to see stickier levels of unemployment. Confidence is going to start to drop, and we won't have had this pent-up demand in the system. Mm-hmm. I'm also very worried about immigration levels are going to drop pretty significantly in the second half of the year and into 2021. And guess what? We have online schools. We have McGill, U of T, a variety of others who are not bringing in their international students. I'm not this crazy housing bear. I'm simply saying, let us be aware of the sequencing of events. Now, I said there was a phase 3 development ahead of us. And to me, phase 3 is what happens after we get a vaccine. What does the new normal look like? I don't know about you, but I'm like permanently scarred here. I'm like freaking out that this happens again. I will now be stockpiling. And actually, we even decided to move from Toronto to Montreal, where we could get a house in the suburbs and actually be able to have space and like a pantry of excess things instead of living in downtown Toronto. So when I talk about phase 3, I talk about the new normal. And as much as I say, I'm concerned about a blip in economic activity, which would include housing, and it's not isolated to housing in the second half of this year, we are spending a lot of time thinking about which cities, regions, and types of housings can actually do well in this. I am bullish Montreal housing. I think that's a market that can do well, particularly if the government is really focused on getting tech in, if they want to focus on bringing in tech jobs, particularly capitalizing on the U.S. not extending H-1 visas. I'm more bullish on suburban housing. I certainly see an opportunity for that. I even suspect that we're going to see corporations moving towards headquarters that are outside of city centers. That's very bullish suburban housing as well. But what I would urge everybody to do is recognize the sequencing of events and what type of housing activity is consistent with that type of sequencing of events. Mm-hmm. So it's about being nuanced and subtle. We should not have extreme bulls, extreme bears, but recognizing that, yes, we are still in an environment where pent-up demand is being significantly unleashed. You should be capitalizing on that if you can. Then we're heading into a period where we're going to stall out on that growth. Doesn't necessarily mean a double dip. Doesn't even necessarily mean price declines. I think it does in some areas, not necessarily. And then we have to think about which areas are going to do well in the longer run. People's decisions are sticky. They're not going to decide 3 months from now that they want a bigger house out in the Montreal suburbs. Well, I did, but I'm a rare exception for a variety of situations. These decisions will take time. So, really be cognizant. And of course, I think you're probably one of the best at doing this, of which sectors, regions, and types of housing do well in different circumstances. It will not be uniform across cities. It will not be uniform across types of housing.
That's super interesting.
Hopefully that answers the question.
No, that was great. You raised another one. So I just thought of, in phase 1, sort of this period, this first 4 months or so, we've kind of seen that the jobs that have been the most impacted have largely been service jobs, impacting probably renters more than homeowners.
Yeah.
Do you see that changing in phase 2? And is phase 2, are we you do? Okay.
Yeah, so I feel so happy that you're actually applying my lesson to even you're like inceptioning me even deeper into the whole idea. So that's exactly right. In phase 1, I think one of the reasons people underestimated housing was that they thought it was people on mortgages that were going to default. So there's 2 things happening in phase 1 that are less likely to happen in phase 2. In phase 1, it's renters and service jobs. In phase 2 is when we probably see those who are going to be rehired are those who are in services jobs who need those to be brought back online. But as we see more and more larger corporations struggle, if we see types of corporation defaults, that's going to shift higher up the income stream in phase 2, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Or put differently, I suspect that rehiring will be stickier for higher income groups. So if you have lost your job in the higher income group, I suspect it's harder to get it back than if you were working retail, for example. But the other thing is that we've had a series of reasons why people, even if they had lost their job, would not be deferring on their mortgages. So even if you were a homeowner, you're getting significant amounts of support, you probably had some savings level, you can have a mortgage deferment. Mortgage deferments are not for forever. So when I think about things that I write in the column of phase 2, the unwinding of not just policy support, but deferments probably lands in that category as well. So the evolution of the type of people who are hurting will change very much over the next year and a half. And, I don't think it's a surprise that rents are falling right now, even if we're not seeing the same sort of activity in kind of the broad home ownership market, because right now we're dealing with that segment. Phase 2, I suspect we see kind of rent stabilize to a certain extent, and then we have to deal with the other component of home ownership.
That's awesome. That was super helpful. We're kind of running out of time. I'm gonna wrap up with 2 quick questions that we're asking all of our participants. So the theme of our conference this year is smart caution, and I'm just curious what smart caution means to you.
Oh, it means don't buy a house you can't afford, because prices do not always go up and your income does not always go up either. If COVID-19 showed us anything, it's that the most outrageous, ridiculous things can happen. And that probably means keeping both your portfolios protected for downside risk and also your personal finances. And while it might feel like you're behind the Joneses in the moment, I don't think anyone ever regrets having additional forms of insurance.
It's a great question, which leads us to our last one for a housing-focused conference. Would you buy or sell a home right now?
Well, John, I am actually in the market. I've been a renter my whole life. I'm going to 3 open houses on Sunday.
Okay.
In Montreal, I would say, in Montreal. Now, I'll tell you that personally, I'm not looking to buy this month. I'm targeting more February, March of next year. That might turn out to be ridiculously silly timing. But for the first time in my life, I am looking around and saying, I think that I can buy a modest home, not as an investment. Don't believe that. Not as an investment, but for a reasonable price in a reasonable neighborhood that gives my family some security. So yes, I would buy a home in this environment. I think it might benefit me to wait another 6 to 10 months to do so, but I'm shopping. And before anyone writes out to me, I already have a real estate agent and he's my brother. And if I don't buy my house with him, I think Christmas is ruined forever.
And are you going to be taking your dad's advice, buying more home that you can afford, or are you taking
absolutely not. My husband keeps trying to bid up the underlying price of our home. No, we are getting the smallest possible house that can fit our little family. I can't wait to pay it all off. And maybe 5-10 years from now, my brother's not a real estate agent anymore, and I can call up a bunch of other people and I can upgrade. But for now, as you said, I think smart caution is key.
Awesome. Frances, thank you so much for taking the time. I learned a lot. Hopefully our viewers learned a lot. So thanks so much for taking time out of your day to speak with us today.
Oh my gosh, it's an absolute pleasure. I hope I get to get back.
Thank you.